House shall come to order.
Okay, welcome everybody to the St Andrews Union Debating Society, the oldest and some might say finest of its kind. Yeah! That was pretty good, but I'm going to make you do it again. Welcome to the St Andrews Union Debating Society, the oldest and some might say finest of its kind. Yeah! Perfect, I knew you had it in you. Welcome everyone. This evening the motion that stands before the House is that this House believes that radical eco-action destroys the image of the movement. It's my pleasure to introduce some wonderful speakers. So on the proposition we have Professor Mike Hulme and William Smith. And on the opposition we have Professor Stuart Haszeldine and Aimee Bennington. So just before we begin tonight's debate, I would like to invite you as our Clerk of the House to read last week's minutes in the style of Greta Thunberg.
How dare you! You have stolen my dreams, my childhood with your empty words.
Point. You lose. You destroyed your own dreams during the UDS.
Point. Yeah, fair enough. There seems to be some disagreement in the House, so we shall have to take a vote by oral acclamation. They never remember, in my defence. Yes, so all those in favour of taking the minutes as read say aye.
Aye.
All those against nay.
Nay.
It seems rather close. I shall have to consult with my sergeant, Ian.
Aye.
Aye. The minutes are taken as read.
Resign.
Bite me. Wonderful. So, without any further ado, I would like to invite the first proposition speaker, Mike Hulme, to begin tonight's debate. Hear, hear!
So in November 2022, Just Stop Oil activists climbed onto the gantries over the London's M25 motorway. Police had to stop traffic, causing gridlock. The protest continued for 4 days and involved 45 activists in all. The subsequent trial, the prosecution alleged the protest caused economic losses of over £1 million and also cost the Metropolitan Police over £1 million. This eco-action caused 50,000 hours of vehicle delay, affecting 700,000 vehicles. Other eco-activists have performed headline-grabbing stunts, from blocking bridges, throwing soup at works of art, to disrupting tournaments, snooker tournaments, and breaking bank office windows. Rather than signalling that these self-styled eco-warriors are in favour of the environment, what such radical eco-activism does is give the impression of being against the people, against, for example, public art, culture, and sport. They'll do anything to interfere with the lives of ordinary people, merely for gaining headlines and temporary media attention. I believe such actions are deeply counterproductive. They alienate ordinary citizens, the very people that any environmental policy will ultimately need the support of. And such actions do nothing to weaken the forcing factors that are altering our climate. How many tons of carbon dioxide have such actions prevented from being emitted into the atmosphere? None. This then is my understanding of radical eco-action, and this evening I'm going to explain why I believe such actions destroy the image of the environmental movement, and why I ask you to support the motion of this House. Let me give you 3 reasons. First, such radical eco-actions give the impression that the environmental movement consists of zealots who are out of touch with the everyday concerns of most people. Radical eco-actions such as that M25 blockade target citizens going about their everyday lives, disrupting people's holidays, attendance at hospital appointments, funerals. The environmental movement needs to do more than these bizarre attention-grabbing tactics in order to denounce modern culture's destabilization of the climate. Rather than being against things that most people value in their daily lives, like the freedom of mobility, overseas holidays, eating what they choose, opting to bear children, The environmental movement needs to offer a positive vision of how society could be different and better. And it needs to bring everybody along with them, or at least to make sure that it does not antagonize the majority. Yet such self-defeating antagonism is exactly what radical eco-actions end up creating. My second argument is this. Radical eco-activists fail to understand that slowing down climate change involves much more than seeking the elimination of fossil fuels. It requires a full-scale reimagination of how societies live and organise their energy economies. This cannot be achieved through hit-and-run revolutionary tactics, villainising oil companies, lightening our burden on the climate, and I believe that we should be doing that. It's a long-run political project that requires the hard work of listening to other voices, discussion of options, and of persuasion. And in the end, as with any political project, it requires reconciling conflicting goals by negotiating compromise. Radical eco-activists try to justify their public nuisance actions on the grounds that they generate a positive radical flank effect. This effect claims that extreme actions by radical groups make moderate groups seem more palatable by comparison, thus securing net public support. Or in social advocacy theory, this is sometimes referred to as shifting the Overton window. But what environmental successes have these radical protests really brought about? A study by the Social Change Laboratory in December 2022, just after the M25 blockade, found no evidence for a positive radical flank effect. Surveying the public before and after the blockade, the study found that awareness of Just Stop Oil had increased. And while there was an increased identification with Friends of the Earth by some people, there was no evidence that the public's support for climate policies had changed. No, what these radical eco-actions had actually done was to further polarise public opinion. And I'm quoting from the study, people who were initially not very supportive of climate policies moved to support climate policies even less, while those who were already supportive of climate policies trended in the opposite direction. So radical eco-actions just offer empty gestures and gain short-lived attention. Maybe they contributed to a few organisations declaring a toothless climate emergency, but what they have not done is generate sustained groundswell of public support that will be needed for the successful implementation of climate policies. Whatever emotional and superficial avowals of temporary environmental concern these protests may have generated in some people, these sentiments are just skin deep. And as we've seen over the last year or two, they are easily squeezed out by the concerns that press more heavily on people. Concerns about the economy, about their livelihoods, about immigration, about rental and house prices. But finally, let me show you that I actually have the leading voices from the environmental movement on my side. In December 2022, Extinction Rebellion, you may have heard of them, called an end to its radical eco-actions. They said, I'm quoting, XR is committed to including everyone in this work because everyone has a role to play. Pointing to the futility, their words, of radical eco-actions, their public statement continued this year, which was 2023, we prioritise attendance over arrest, relationships over roadblocks, as we stand together and become impossible to ignore. Or take another example. The Climate Majority Project was co-founded in 2022 by my ex-colleague at the University of East Anglia, Rupert Reed. The CMP, Climate Majority Project, eschews radical eco-actions. Rather, they seek to create a popular and moderate flank, not a radical one. And in their words, again I'm quoting, the CMP helps people from many backgrounds take meaningful action to help drive the systemic change that we need. The cultural norms, and listen to this, the cultural norms and sensitivities of left-wing and progressive groups tend to dominate the activist space. And so climate action groups tend to self-select. And they go on to say, millions of people feel the significance of climate breakdown. So a mainstream movement must make anybody feel at home. Note this language. Many backgrounds, anybody feel at home. Avoid in-group self-selection. Disrupting the lives of ordinary citizens by radical eco-actions, which in Reid's terms are the climate majority, ordinary citizens are the climate majority, it's no way to make anybody feel at home in a social movement. My friends, this evening I've shown you that radical eco-actions alienate ordinary citizens, that eco-activists fail to offer or inspire a positive vision of the future, and in XR's own words, that radical and disruptive eco-actions are futile. What the environmental movement needs, and I'm quoting Rupert Reid here again, relationships, not roadblocks, attendance, not arrests. My honoured guest, I move the motion of this House that radical eco-action destroys the image of the environmental movement.
I'd like to thank Professor Hulme for that fine speech, and now cross the table and give the floor to Professor Haszeldine to continue the debate. Hear, hear.
Thank you very much, Chair. So I aim in this to try and take a longer perspective, and a perspective which, of course, is based on my home subject area of geoscience, viewing the planet as a whole, how the planet works, how the planet fits together, and how humans relate to that planet. And I believe that radical action is needed now, because we face, as a species, across all the continents and all the races, we face a catastrophe, gradually and slowly, but developing faster and faster, a catastrophe which no humans have ever seen before, and a catastrophe which could easily terminate our species. It won't terminate the Earth, but it could easily terminate our species. But I don't want to go scaremongering, I don't want to belabor that point. But we've started off as a species living, hunting, moving, gathering through wild country, closely connected with nature. And as our species has grown in numbers, we've become progressively disconnected and progressively alienated. And we've moved gradually into an extractive culture, an industrial culture, where we're used to digging materials out of the ground, using them for our own ends to make our lives a little bit easier, and then throwing those things away. And that clearly can't continue in any shape or form. Over the past years, since 1650 in Scotland, the Industrial Revolution started with the large-scale extraction of coal. That's one of the reasons Scotland and the UK has become so industrialised, why it gained an empire so early, why in many places the 1850s is taken as the start of industrialisation after it had disseminated out from Scotland and the UK. And that has changed our climate. We've persistently developed that fossil fuel extraction for coal, then oil, then gas, by taking literally millions of years of carbon out of the underground, combusting that and converting that for our own purposes to produce heat or energy or power, and throwing away the carbon dioxide consequence of that into our common and shared atmosphere. And as we've done that, our common and shared atmosphere has gradually increased its carbon dioxide content, invisibly at first, but now very measurably, year on year, the carbon dioxide increases more and more. We know all this, but we've taken no action. The carbon dioxide increases continually, year after year, irrespective of the number of climate conferences, irrespective of the number of political agreements, irrespective of the meters length or gigabytes of data and published reports, all approved by governments. So we've known that, of course, since experimental science of the 1820s with Fourier, 1856 with Eunice Foote discovering carbon dioxide linked to global heating in the United States, Tyndall discovering the carbon dioxide absorbed heat in the atmosphere. All that science has been known for hundreds of years, and we've taken no action on that. We've made measurements. David Keeling in the United States was mandated to climb the tallest mountain, or drive, since it's the United States, drive to the tallest mountain in Hawaii and measure the carbon dioxide content since 1958. And that's been continued during his lifetime and after his lifetime, still measured today. It's absolutely clear that those measurements, no modelling involved, have started with carbon dioxide at 320 parts per million, and we're now at 420 something parts per million. A relentless increase, no matter what we've done to change our beliefs, to change our energy systems, to develop renewable energies. We're still producing more and more and more carbon, and we are not taking notice of that, the effects of that, because we know that industrialization has given huge power to political entities which are larger than states. Huge power to large states such as the United States, such as the United Kingdom, the European Union, who are rich in carbon wealth and have used that carbon wealth to create money, to create power, to create colonies, to rule people, to dictate the terms on which we live in that extractive and usage economy, and ignoring the relationships that we have with the natural environment, the benefits we have for recreation of that natural environment, the benefits of food growth, the benefits of farming, of trees, of harvesting. We're intimately of pure water. We're intimately intertwined with that natural environment. But all the time, we've pushed that back and back and back because we've become so alienated from that. And why is this? I don't know. We'll find out in a minute. But political solutions have been tried at the top-down national level. The first climate conference was the Rio conference, really, in 1992, followed by the United Nations in 1994, following the Alliance of Parties, which meets every year. You might remember that meeting in Glasgow 3 or 4 years ago, COP26, COP29 in Azerbaijan last November. These are big meetings where people expend huge quantities of time, money and effort and fuel flying to these events to meet the people they met with the year before and meet the people they met with the year before that, but to no real outcome in changing the way we behave. Okay, so the COP in Azerbaijan had an impact in a negative way, in that Azerbaijan was found to be trying to do oil deals or gas production deals on the side of, whilst hosting the allegedly climate-saving conference meeting. So people in power are eternally conflicted. They're pulled in both ways of trying to do one thing but really being paid by another. Okay, so that's a huge problem. And as problem builds upon problem, we've made international agreements. In Paris 2015, we agreed, all the major countries of the world agreed to limit warming to 1.5 degrees of warming above that pre-industrial 1850 global temperature. Of course, last year, in 2024, the world went through that 1.5 degree limit several years earlier than predicted. So we're now into the uncharted territory of what happens. We're committed, legally committed from the Paris Agreement, to keep temperatures less than 2 degrees of global warming. But I predict we'll go straight through that as well, because we're not paying any attention to how to decrease our dependence and interdependence in usage of that fossil fuel. We're not communicating about the real problem with each other. We're just communicating about how to carry on behaving as we behave and make more money and take the easier route to this fossil fuel use, which supports our economy. But I'll argue that science and engineering has told us that humans can fight climate change. We can decrease the drivers of carbon dioxide by halting fossil fuel use. We know how to do that. CO2 can be recovered by machines from the air. Very expensive, but we can do that. Much easier to recover CO2 from the air and draw back on that climate change by planting trees, by planting vegetation, by using those to store CO2 in a permanent way. And we can and have and are developing sources of energy which work from natural sources as wind, sun, tidal power, even nuclear power, can produce energy at large scale, at low cost and safely. And humans can be organised to believe that and come together by doing that with large groups of people. So we do have hope for that. But we also know that there are plenty of deniers of climate change out there. So probably a third of the people in the UK still are uncertain, deny climate, but there is a consensus, and that consensus came together in 2008 in the UK Parliament, where all parties agreed to pass the climate change bill. That climate change bill has enabled us to move forward and to come together and draw up laws and principles to stop climate change happening. But radical means we also have to do things like change the way we behave. We have to eat differently. We have to travel differently. We have to consume clothes differently. We have to consume less. We have to form a circular economy, not just a sustainable economy. So we can do all of those things, but what's stopping us is that action by proxy is what's happening. And I think the radical action by people who are taking direct action still has a role to play, because that's something which people who are not able to act quite so much with quite so much agency, those people can look at that direct action and think, I believe in that. Other people are doing something to try and stop this tide. Other people are doing something to try and come together. It may not be me, I may disagree with some of it, but I do agree with most of it. So I believe that radical action is useful and is an essential part of coming together to fight against climate change.
I'd like to thank Professor Haszeldine for that fine speech, and now welcome our Father of the House, William Smith, to continue the debate. Here.
The thing I want to keep in your head is what this debate is actually about, which is what the image of the movement looks like. What is the image that we're actually debating? It's actually one that's already been quite clearly laid out. It's the aspect of inclusivity, of equitability, the notion that all of us have a role to play and all of us should be allowed to play our role. But what the radical eco-action does in some ways exactly what Leader of Opposition says. It targets individuals, people on their day-to-day lives that are just trying to make a living, trying to send their kids to school, trying to get to the hospital so they don't die. But instead, eco-radical action targets these people who have never extracted oil out of the ground, these people who would have pursued green options if they were provided a choice. It's the eco-action, or the radical eco-action, that makes individuals feel as if they don't have a voice in the movement, and thus creates the image that the eco-movement mustn't be about the ordinary individual, and thus a priori must damage the image of the movement. I'm also going to do some nice rebuttal, because I am a debater after all. The first thing to point out is it kind of does a Lawrence in the opposition, which you'll know if you know what that means, which is there's a lot of reasoning provided why there may not be any action taken, or nothing that we could do about it, but then proposes all of the solutions that we already have, for instance. We have 2050 net neutrality in the UK national grid, for instance. There's massive increased numbers of reporting. We've already banned fracking in this company. The transition to the Western world will be green, irrespective of what eco-radical action does. Funding of the Leader of Opposition's own research, for instance, is indication of the fact that the world is already moving away from the notion that there is no solutions. The fact that we have Green New Deals within the European Union, for instance. The fact that we have banned chlorohydrocarbons, for instance, that were in fridges as a result of the ozone crisis in the 1990s. The fact that we have restoration effects as a massive reforestation of the UK and restoration of peatlands. This very own university, for instance, is funding its own forest in the Cairngorms, as well as peat restoration, which no doubt Aimee and I know because we were involved partly in it, which is a consequence of the fact that actually you do not need radical action in order to get change. Change happens anyway. Radical action prevents it from doing so. We've already heard loads of reasons that I think are unresponded to at the moment to why radical action is destroying both the image of the movement and indeed its propensity to do good things. But I wanted to nail into a specific aspect of this, which is the way in which the radical eco-action destroys the notion that young individuals have a role to play and makes them seem as if they are a type of alien part of this movement that shouldn't be given a voice because of the types of actions it has done. The reason for this is quite simple, right? Because if you have an idea in your head of the people that sat on the M25, or the people who are on Greenpeace barges going into oil rigs, for instance, to cause disruption and damage the safety of the people on board, the people that come to your mind are probably young people, right? People like our age, people who probably have the time to do this kind of stuff, but also individuals who are so motivated that they would want to maybe in some ways take out their life in a consequence of this. This therefore means that the way in which radical eco-action but is also interpreted in places like the media is young people. Why is this problematic is it shows that radical eco-action is a young phenomenon, and that if we want to get rid of radical eco-action, which many politicians do, it's directly about alienating younger individuals. And this actually permeates to not just people who do radical action, people like Aimee and myself, for instance, young individuals trying to make a change to the institution they were doing. Why does this turn about, right? Because what is easy if you are an opposition or a denier, as leader of opposition says, is if you have a young individual who's being so disruptive, who seems to be so middle class, the fact that they can just be on the M25 at 4 o'clock on a Monday afternoon and doesn't seem to have any other concern, it makes it seem as if these people, younger people, must be fundamentally out of touch, as leader of opposition says, but also just these young people must have really simplified, antagonistic opinions of the environmental movement in ways that makes it really easy to dismiss a young individual, irrespective of the types of propositions they're arguing. Yes, some young individuals pursue radical actions, but most young individuals have quite common sense ideas. But because of things that we've seen in the media, for instance, it makes it really easy for people at institutions like our own, or businesses, governments, political action groups that aren't necessarily radical, to think of a young individual in that light of someone who is incredibly radical, and therefore far easily dismiss what that person is trying to do. This is therefore fundamentally isolating, but becomes fundamentally dismissive in the way in which it approaches these individuals. That in and of itself has destroyed the image of the movement. The idea that all of us have a role to play and all of us should be respected in the ways in which we want to make environmental change. But recognize this becomes cyclical, right? Insofar as when individuals are isolated and dismissed, it tends to make them even more radical, which tends to make them more isolated and therefore more dismissed of their tendencies. Which is why, for the vast majority of young individuals who don't pursue radical action, the first time we try to raise our voice to people at this university, which I could rant for 5 years, for instance, is we get called student politicians. We get called individuals who have no ideas, and we get patronized to and dismissed to. This is a product of radical eco-action, changing the idea of what it means for young individuals to be in the environmental movement that not only impedes upon its capacity to do good, but actually in itself destroys the image. Is there an intervention, Aimee? I'm going to start the rebuttal. No?
You'll have to wait for it.
Oh, you have to wait for it. Oh, that's sad. So this, I think, undermines an aspect of young people being in the movement. But why does this fundamentally damage the image, right? Because it's quite difficult trying to think about this motion to what the image of something actually looks like, right? Because there are multiple ways in which you can internalize what the environmental movement is. Here is an analogy that I want to use. Imagine you have a picture of Jenny here, for instance, and everyone that we see here. Even if one part of this is desaturated, like someone who takes photos for the UDS Society would know this, is you desaturate one aspect of the image, you in of itself destroyed the image. Because how you internalize it, how you interpret it, how you think about it, has been fundamentally changed. So the burden on government bench here is just to prove that there's an aspect of the image that without radical action would be an image that we'd actually want to have. Because you would never want to destroy something that you didn't like, for instance. I think, therefore, what opposition bench has to demonstrate is why the inclusivity of young individuals pursuing moderate actions, being respected as people who have a legitimate voice, is something that we should want in the environmental movement rather than something that we don't. I think fundamentally we should want people pursuing moderate action irrespective of their age, their ethnicity, their background, and this radical eco-action dismisses them. The rebuttal that might come here is you might think radical eco-action is a legitimate form of how young individuals get involved and in some ways emboldens the movement. I.e., I know Amy's going to argue this because she told me she was going to argue this, which is the idea that it makes moderate individuals, it makes the movement itself seem as if it must be more moderate because you're dissociating yourself from radical individuals. But recognize that just squirrels the motion, right? Because the burden of the debate is to think about how people internalize the movement. It is far easier to think about image in the most negative line, insofar as it is the most massively disruptive to your life. Yes, you want environmental action. Yes, you want to improve yourself. But when you're on Channel 4 News or GBU News, if you want to watch that kind of shit, what you actually see is younger individuals pursuing radical action that just prevents people from going to the hospital, results in people dying, and this massively changes the perception of what the environmental movement must be. You now look to things like politicians to be the solution to the answer, not individuals who are experts in the environmental movement. It makes you turn to people who have no lived experience of what it's like being in the global south, for instance, having to be affected by environmentalism. Instead, you look to the moderate individuals, the people who are business leaders, people who are expected to be able to talk about this issue. And in itself, that means you have destroyed the environmental movement and its image. I think this is sufficient to win the debate, hopefully, 14th time asking everyone. But the last thing I want to leave you on is this, which is you can still have direct action on our side, it's just the type of action. So far as everything Leader of Opposition said about radical action is true, this is why it makes you think that individual action in itself must be radical. But in actual fact, it mustn't, right? It is just an aspect of direct action that mustn't be targeted on the individual. What radical eco-action does is it's usually individuals taking it out on other individuals that weren't responsible for that cause. Because in some ways, individuals cannot cause a massive change of their own accord. They can't stop BP extracting as individuals. We must be a collective, and as strong as a collective we can be is the best way in which we're actually going to get environmental change, hence what we've been seeing now. But as soon as you have radical eco-action, you destroy the collective because you remove what is probably the most vocal most vocal aspect of the movement, younger individuals, but those that will be there for the longest and have to actually reap the consequences of what happens if we get this wrong. These are the individuals that must be allowed to be in the movement. Radical action gets rid of them in the movement. I'm a BP debater, so 7 minutes is all I'm used to. Cool, propose.
Thank you very much to William for that fine speech and for the unbridled attack on both Lawrence and Jamie. I'd now like to cross the table and give the floor to Aimee Bennington. Here! Cool. Okay, I'm just going to respond directly to William first of all and then reconstruct our case massively on the subject of image. Okay, on this point of age, interestingly enough, if you actually do your research, all of those people charged for the most recent plan to disrupt the M25 were over 40, most of them were over 60. I'm not sure where this point about them being like the majority young people is even coming from. Okay, but on this point about, the more salient point of institutional bias against young people, if they seem to be like all radical and all this kind of things, William explains that he and I, and many other young people like us, are involved in eco-initiatives. We're producing research on sustainability. We're involved in, different schemes like Footprint East Nuke and so on. How? Because we're supported by funders, we're supported by institutions, we're supported by older people who believe in our potential as young people with new ideas who are motivated to solve this crisis. Right? This is how we got to the position we're in. This is why we're speaking here today. I just don't think this argument holds any water whatsoever. I tried to say once in a discussion with industry that I was only a PhD student. I was only a young person, so I couldn't have much of a say on things. I was shouted down and told that yes, they want to hear our point of view as young people on the climate crisis. They also say that it's nice to think negatively. I think the main reason that most of us turn off the news when it comes to talking about Elon Musk or Donald Trump is that we like to think positively. And William, why are you investing time writing papers on sustainability and planting trees if you're thinking negatively and you a negative utilitarian and a cynic? Doesn't make sense. Okay, now, reconstructing our case on debunking the activist dilemma. So the activist dilemma is a term given to the trade-off made by individual activists when they undertake radical activism. That the actions they take to draw attention to an issue cause them to be disliked by those they are trying to convince. Now, this is very intuitive, right? If a protest blocks a street, we need to go down, we get annoyed at the people who are doing it. We think, well, couldn't you have made your point in some other way? That didn't make myself or others experience negative emotions. Now, beyond intuition, this is actually borne out by research. For example, Colin Davis of the University of Bristol finds that across protests about climate change, racial justice and abortion rights among British, American and Polish participants, protesters who use radical action are seen as more immoral and participants feel a reduced emotional connection to the protesters. Okay, that's fine. But interestingly enough, this reduced emotional connection doesn't apply beyond the individual protester. The authors find no reduction in support for the movement associated with the protest. In other words, as you might expect, people are smart enough to separate what they don't like about an individual's methods from their opinion of a cause as a whole. Now, to add another layer to this consideration is the appreciation of the uniqueness of the relationship between radical eco-activism and the punishment for protesters. Now, eco-activists do what they do to protect our collective natural heritage, our health, our safety, and our freedom of access to the wonders of nature. In return, they are punished by incarceration, the loss of their own well-being, their own safety, their freedom of movement, and their own access to nature. Radical environmental activists know that by standing up for what we all know is right, they might lose the most fundamental of human freedoms, their own connection to the natural world. That by protecting the air, the water, and the life that is of the most fundamental value to all of us, for us, they might lose what they most value for the rest of their days. I argue that when we perceive radical eco-activism, we can feel annoyance, grievance, and feel that we would and should have done a different thing if we were that activist, but at the same time, we're confirmed in our perception of the validity and the necessity of acting on solutions to the issue, because why else would anyone campaign for something they value in a way that causes them to lose access to that very thing that they value? But how does this improve the image of the movement? So I now turn to something called the positive radical flank effect. Thank you very much to the first speaker, which I propose that they can reference as a popular term precisely because it has so much supporting evidence. Now, this was advanced, among others, by Matthew Feinberg at the University of Toronto. Now, Feinberg conducted a study with more than 1,000 participants controlled for gender, political leanings, which used fabricated news articles to assess people's perception of a movement as a whole in response to fake reports of radical activism for the environment and the animal rights movement. Now, they found that radical tactics actually increased support for the moderate mainstream of the movement. Now, think back to the example of a street protest. You walk into the street, your way is blocked, you think, this is so annoying, couldn't they have done this by some other way? It would be so much better if they actually engaged with politicians and made concrete changes on the ground instead of disrupting my day. Now, it turns out that this is exactly the train of thought that people follow, and which increases support for the elements of the movement that we think are doing the right thing. Over here, that's people like the RSPB, Nature Scotch, Natural England, the Nature Conservancy, WWF, Greenpeace, Operation Wallacea, local tree planting groups like Footprint East Nuke, the Green Shores Project. The list just goes on and on. NGOs and charities that have the skills and the people on the ground negotiating deals with governments and industry to protect and enhance the environment. Now, the leader of the proposition says that this is what we need. Guess what? We're already doing it. Crucially, this positive radical flank effect, it depends on action, not agenda. So if a group only says that they're going to do a radical act, but never actually does it, you don't get the benefit to the image of the movement. But if they do carry out that act, support for the movement increases. Now, this depends on two important elements that both depend on contrast. The first of these is simply dissociation from the radical flank. That is, the more a mainstream movement condemns radical acts done in its name in favor of peaceful protest and structural change, the greater the increase in support for the mainstream movement. Now, this is often very easy for a movement to do, because the most extreme acts of eco-sabotage, the ones that we hate most of all, tend to be the most misguided. Like, for example, in 2001, there was an arson attack against the Center for Urban Horticulture at the University of Washington, which was conducted on the belief that the center was engaged in GM research. Now, it wasn't, and of course the repair of the subsequent damage ends up being costly to the environment. But notice that this is something that's very, very easy for the mainstream movement to distance itself from. Now, fortunately, this overt dissociation from radical acts is becoming ever easier, since the 2020 changes to UK laws around people's rights to protest means that what we traditionally consider to be peaceful street protests and marches are now considered to be and can be sensationalized within the media as radical action. Okay, so you can get the benefits of dissociation from the radical flank with far less inconvenience to the people affected by that radical action just by doing more moderate things. So it's now in the interest of the moderate movement to encourage what we call responsible extremism, peacefully occupying machinery, standing protests outside Parliament or businesses, sitting in trees so they can't be cut down, all these kinds of things that get sensationalized by the media but don't actually harm people directly. Now, the second element is proximity. That is, the sooner you learn about a moderate mainstream movement to the time that you are exposed to a report of radical action in the name of the movement, the more positive you will feel about that mainstream movement. Now, this plays right into the hand of radical action because, one, radical action is striking. It is readily able to be sensationalized by the media for profit because it makes interesting reading. We all like to read about a good drama. Now, this provides a key opportunity for the mainstream movement to provide comment on the event within media, actively dissociating itself from the radical action. Now, you get the benefit of dissociation from the radical flank that I spoke about, but this is now also enhanced by proximity, the fact that the reader is exposed to the mainstream movement at the same time as they're reading about the radical act. And this also gives the movement an opportunity to draw attention to the good structural changes that it's driving, and more visibility when encouraging people to sign petitions, volunteer, make donations, all that kind of good stuff. Now, the first speaker acknowledges that this is exactly what Extinction Rebellion has done. It's distanced itself from radical action. Why? Because it improves their image, precisely. Now, you might wonder whether these effects are in some way dependent upon people's existing political inclinations, and you would be right to wonder that. Now, other studies have shown with an even larger pool of participants that if you break down participants into independents, Democrats, or Republicans, this is a bit too American focused for my liking, but anyway, that's the research, that the effects I've described, this positive radical flank effect, hold up for independents and Democrats, so that it massively increases their support for the moderate aspects of the movement. While if you actually survey Republicans and people who don't really agree with the movement, their impression doesn't actually change. And I think this is because intuitively, if you already feel that a movement doesn't align with your incentives, you already kind of think the worst about them. You've already created these stories in your head, and hearing about it in the news actually doesn't change that. You already thought the worst of them. So notice that on net, we get benefits to the movement in 2 sides, and on the third, we get no change. So on net, we've got a massive benefit there. Okay. Finally, improvement of the image of the movement by self-identification. So note here that if you participate in radical activism, you tend to feel more a part of the movement, and that the movement itself is more a part of you. Why? Because adrenaline, sure. The social connections that you make during the radical activism, the empowerment that you feel because of taking action. Also because by being active within the movement through the lens of your own beliefs in what that movement should be and what it should be doing, makes the movement seem more aligned to your preferences, and you therefore view it more positively because it literally is depending on what your own preferences are while you're doing the action. Okay, so hopefully I've addressed for you why we get an increase to the positive image of the movement for the individual who is partaking in the radical activism, but also for the mainstream body of the movement as a whole, the people who are actually doing the positive things on the ground, who can make a difference politically and just literally in your community by planting trees, restoring the shoreline, doing all these kind of positive good stuff. And the more that we can shore up the image of those parts of the movement, the more positive change that we can possibly get. Very, very proud to propose. I'd like to thank Aimee for that fine speech and for proving that some VP debaters can speak to time. So now it's time to open the debate to the floor, which means that anybody in attendance can stand and give a speech of up to 2 minutes in order to potentially win the floor speech prize, which, what is it this week? Toppings, £15 voucher for toppings for your next half of the semester books needs. Wonderful. So without any further ado, any speeches from the floor this evening, please raise your hand. Yes, Katie.
I did actually write stuff down, so I hope we shouldn't ramble on too much. So I think the important question here in terms of whether radical action is something that will benefit the image of a movement or ties the image of a movement is who does the radical action affect. Radical action against the people in power gives power to the disenfranchised, whereas action against the working person only disenfranchises them further. Radical action can and has been an amazing tool in a variety of movements, fighting for queer rights, women's rights, civil rights in all forms, voting rights, all sorts of issues have been drastically improved by radical action. And these people are massive heroes we will think of who took radical action against the people in power. But when radical action affects the people who are already disenfranchised, already vulnerable, you just make things worse. You must fight radically with people. You cannot fight radically against them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Caden. Any other speeches from the floor this evening? Yes, at the back, please stand and state your name for the minutes.
Sorry, I will admit I'm a bit biased towards the proposition, but I will try to find some holes in the argument that I would like my questions answered on that. So, first of all, the first speaker mentions the Overton window and how the inherent villainization of oil companies, which I personally disagree with, but I can see where a more moderate person might be coming from. The first speaker mentioned that that was an issue, and that if if climate movements cannot be made at home for everyone, then it is a problem for the future of the movement as a whole. However, I have to ask, if the Overton window does not involve like some acknowledgement of the impact of the harm, the genuine harm that the nonchalance of climate villains, I suppose, or offenders have been doing, does that really, can it really be an effective movement in a way that actually matters? If the Overton window is not shifted ever so slightly to appeal to a broader audience, can it really be an effective movement? Also, I would like to talk in a more broader global context. I do agree, coming into this debate, I did realize that Scotland had a variety of funding and initiatives to promote green, just sort of green action, compared to the countries that I come from, many other places in the entire world. And I would like to tie this to points that both the proposition and the opposition have made about individualism and collectivism and the way that ties to their movements. How would they suppose that this will work in a more broader global context, especially with COP26 and all the G7 meetings that we've had over the years, just completely failing to acknowledge the developed world in the way that matters?
Thank you very much. I didn't quite catch your name for the minutes. What was it? Sorry. Thank you very much. Okay, other speeches from the floor. Yep, just here, Callie.
Hi. I'm sort of echoing some of what some people have said before me, and also sort of the last note the proposition left us on with the I just deleted what my notes were. All right, let's do this off the top of my head. I think that I would like to hear a better definition of what radical eco-action means, and does that include eco-action that isn't just focused on ordinary lives? Because there are some radical eco-action that are taken not just against the ordinary people, but against the institutions that like, the climate villains people are talking about beforehand, that I would like to argue I would like to see an argument around how much that is affecting their image versus other images. I mean, off the top of my head, I can think of groups like Liberate Tate or BP or Not BP that do similar things to Just Stop Oil, but not in the exact same way as Just Stop Oil. So they fall in what I would assume is a similar category, but they succeeded in breaking down the relationship between BP and the Tate Modern or the British Museum, and I think that there needs to be at least a clear definition on how much is that radical, or is that not as radical? Is that part of the action that we are all supposed to be casually taking part of? Thank you.
Okay, thank you to Callie. Other speeches from the floor. Let's do Ksenia.
Although this destroys in the present tense, I would encourage the opposition to consider the impacts that radical movements have on creating a history or legacy of inspiration for future activists. I would note that very famous radical eco-activist Seamus on trees, for example, in the Amazon, other people are often serve as an inspiration for you to enter the movement, even if they are seen negatively in the status quo. So even though in the status quo they may be seen as disruptive or as harmful, there is a certain sensationalism that is able to create a positive, even greater involvement in the future that I think the proposition should consider. Thank you.
Okay, thank you to Ksenia. Other speeches from the floor that aren't all? No? Okay, let's do. Oh, yes, sorry, yourself. Yes, just here. Please stand to state your name for the minute.
Hello, my name's Callum. I suppose it will be a quick one. I'd just like to hear from the proposition, kind of if apathy is such kind of the enemy of the movement, how a more moderate approach will get people caring enough.
Wonderful, thank you to Callum. Okay, let's do Owen first.
Yeah, I just want to respond to the study kind of we got out of the proposition saying that this is something that is polarizing but not actually changing overall attitude. I think this is an argument for op, because the status quo is doing nothing in support of the movement. So if you are more radically doing nothing to support environmentalism and still doing the same things you do today, that is still nothing. But when you have the other side being more emboldened and wanting to take additional action, then you get additional outcomes on net.
Owen. Let's do Jamie.
Well, I'd like to address a little bit of confusion I had during this debate, because I'm not quite too sure what the status quo is. I believe the status quo to be one, a society in which radical action is taking place. I mean, it almost seems like every few days or every few weeks we're having a plane being painted green, or some people running out into a football field somewhere and attacking football players or what have you, so on and so forth. But I'd argue under the status quo, very much to the opposition's point, not a lot is being done to help the environment. So if that aligns with a world in which you do have radical action, then aren't you not helping your case by saying that not enough is being done to help the environment? In other words, if radical action were to help the image of the movement, wouldn't a lot more be getting done under the status quo? To Kassemi's point, the emboldening of movements into the future is very important, and I would like to hear the opposition speak more to that. However, I did come into this room wanting to vote for proposition, and despite William's comments, I think I'm still going to have to side with the proposition, although I will warn you, I'm not going to select your good photos.
Too right. Other speeches from the floor. We've got time for 4 more, so let's do Jack, Alex, and then Pathfinder.
Yeah, I'd like to follow up on what Owen said, actually, and begin by talking about the definition we get from William about what image means. Because I think image to mean inclusiveness is slightly questionable. Maybe, like you say, if this is part of the image, that maybe you can get away with this. But I would argue that there is a singular, most important aspect of image when we're talking about this debate. Because fundamentally, the climate movement is a protest movement. It's a movement that seeks to create change. So surely the image that matters most when we're talking about any protest movement, any movement that seeks to create change, is whether it is one that can be safely ignored, that can be dismissed as being fringe or only supported by a small group of people, or whether it is one that is popular and has to be listened to because a sufficient number of people are going to act on it, which means that politicians, businesses have to actually listen to what they're saying. So I don't think that this is actually particularly the strongest thing. And this is why the polarization point is actually important. Because maybe you don't need the entirety of society to broadly, slightly agree on what you want to do to actually create a change. Maybe if you get 10% of people who are very much strongly in favour, who are prepared to boycott a museum if they're sponsored by BP, who are prepared to vote in a particular way because of climate movements and climate promises by certain politicians, I think that's probably enough, right? I think that probably if a movement manages to mobilise 10% of people to most strongly believe in what they're saying, so much so that they're willing to actually affect society and have to be listened to as a result, then surely that is actually what image matters most. It doesn't really matter if a few more people hate the climate movement, because who cares?
Okay, thank you to Jack. Let's go to Alex.
Well, radical action in any form of protest is meant to be annoying and frustrating. That's its goal. Its goal is to annoy and frustrate a target group of people into usually giving in or sort of agreeing to do something on a specific issue. And that works really well for single issue protest movements. It does, because whether it is sort of convince your government to sanction a country, or I don't know, if you want to take a really good example of really radical action, take the suffragette movement, sort of extend suffrage to universal suffrage. And these movements that turn to radical action have a bad image, because radical action, as I said, is annoying. When it comes to the environment, however, that's not an option, because the environment is not a single issue. It touches on so many things. You're not trying to annoy and frustrate people into just doing one little thing. You're trying to convince people to essentially change everything. From companies spending millions to install, say, really expensive filters in their factories, to people changing, for example, their really old boilers, which is extremely costly. That is change that no one's going to do by just being so frustrated, because you're asking people to change their everyday life. As such, radical legal action is sort of the point is that radical legal action does damage the image of the movement by definition, because any sort of radical action that is disruptive is going to annoy people, and as such is going to damage the image, the good image of your movement, so to speak. But what is even more problematic here is that it really does not serve the movement's interests. Thank you very much.
Thank you to Alex. Let's go to Parth.
Okay, so I have one thing for prop and op. So the first thing I have is that the burden for what destroys me is currently unfulfilled on the proposition bench. I think it's a sense of permanence, i.e. that there is no way to maybe rehabilitate that image, or that it is a binary black and white, that it's particularly so badly damaged that you're not going to get any support at all. There needs to be more responses, charitably, to opposition to explain why the cases where they are showing efficacy are not completely destroying movement, and there needs to be analysis on this, which I'm sure William will give now. But I also want to agree with the floor speech over here by Callie, which is that the environmental movement, uniquely, unlike other social movements, is quite splintered globally and across the global south, which William has mentioned. So he should expect this coming out of me. So often when it comes to global politics, the scale of people that live in the developing world is much higher than has existed on this entire table at the moment so far. The intense impact of these countries is much higher. There are more, like Bangladesh is being flooded, the Maldives is being flooded, this is more important and as well. But third of all, the sentiment of being pro-radical is much, much easier to buy into in these countries in the first place. For example, destroying a pipeline to prevent oil spills for water being polluted is good eco-action, because it creates a chilling effect where companies don't want to invest in these areas in the first place because it's not a Western country where there's loads of regulation in the first place. So they pull out. This handles Alex's own floor speech about people being frustrated in the first place, because it's not about that. You can make meaningful action in the first place. And you need to give some weighing in the deputy proposition speech about why young people being villainised matters more than people in the developing country who literally don't have safe water. On the opposition, I'm inclined to vote based on second opposition speaker's analysis, but I need one question answered and I'm willing to vote there. The first is the people who matter, legislative action and politicians, us as voters is very limited. So what the studies that's coming out of DLO is like, well, you've got 1,000 people who think that the news cycle won't change. But these people also need to be the ones that actually enforce the action or have action onto them. For example, you could crack down as a company, you could create more apathy, or the WWF or Greenpeace could just distance themselves from these movements and not actually give them money, as I say. So there needs to be some analysis as to why, if this is all the case, and moderates are willing to buy more, why is then the action still being produced? And why are these NGOs still supporting them? And I think these are the questions I would like answered. And good luck, William, on your way.
Thank you very much to all of our speakers from the floor this evening. Some excellent contributions. I think our speakers have a lot of work cut out for them in the next 20 minutes or so. But without further ado then, I would like to invite the opposition back to continue. We go in reverse order. We would start then with Aimee, and you'll have 5 minutes if that's the agreed upon time.
It's not in the inverse, you go first.
Oh, we're doing 5 minutes each?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, that's nice.
5 minutes each, yeah.
Oh, perfect.
Okay, wonderful. So I would like to invite Aimee back to continue the debate. Okay. Yeah.
I don't know whose idea it was to put the bar at the bottom of the table. It makes it impossible to go out.
It's the carpet as well, you can't move the chair properly.
Okay, so I think I'll just respond to Parth's floor speech first. So why NGOs will still support this radical action and how you actually get constructive change among institutions and so on. Okay, so I think the NGOs supporting the radical activists, most of this kind of happens under the table, and that you get NGOs kind of encouraging the people within them to take part in more peaceful forms of radical protest so that they can then capitalize upon that to make use of all of the kinds of dissociation effects that I talked about. Okay, this is actually quoted in a lot of studies where they point to the fact that this is now like the major incentive for NGOs to do this in a way that's not harmful to them, but massively improves their movement. And in terms of like getting structural change, generally this comes about because if you make yourself look far more palatable than these radical activists to the government, then it becomes in the government's best interest to make larger concessions to you as a moderate group to try and shut down those radical activists. Now, this happened massively when it came to for example, the Insulate Britain campaign, where people were doing all this kind of radical action, making these huge demands. This made the mainstream look a lot more palatable, and then so the government conceded and paid out a lot of money to incentivize people to insulate their homes. Massive change for the climate because of that. The whole, this whole structure of how you get change is all because, these protests make it seem, because obviously you as a politician, you don't want to have massive street protests under your watch. It looks quite bad on you. So you think, if I can do something, if I can make some concession that shuts that down, so I politically, in terms of my political image, don't have to deal with that anymore, then that looks to you like a far better option to take. Compared to if you just had one moderate movement which was making claims on you, but then you have no political incentive to satisfy those claims. So this is how this kind of action comes about. Okay, on Alex's point about, there's many issues and we need some kind of universal change. Well, I hate to break it to you, Alex, but the government and even the best structural institutions we have can't really change the global consciousness at one fell swoop. But what we can do is we can address lots and lots of small issues and make meaningful change, because people working on the ground can only deal with so much at a time. But if we have lots of different people, lots of different action groups who are each specialising in different areas, whether that's home insulation, whether that's rewilding the Scottish glens, whether that's carbon capture solutions, then we can make meaningful change. And if we focus our protests and radical activism on all of these different movements at different points in time, at different places around the world, we can get meaningful concessions. And if you get meaningful concessions within one government, I think it's much more likely that other governments will see that as a viable option for something they can do. So if you change all of these different things independently, you piece by piece, bite by bite, change the way people operate in the world, and that brings about the kind of global changes that we really need to see. It's just like if you approach an assignment, you can't just sort of suddenly picture everything you need to write in your mind and just splatter onto the page. You break the argument down, you take it piece by piece, and slowly you build up a whole cohesive argument that makes your point. That's the approach that we're trying to take here, and this is why radical activism can be so powerful. On the definition of radical eco-activism. Now, it's literally anything defined as disruptive, whether that be peaceful or otherwise. Now, to answer Jack's speech, that includes things like boycotts, because these are disruptive to the operation of the company. So if you boycott a company, you are taking part in radical action, and we know that that's a very effective thing to do, whether it's boycotting Dove, boycotting BP, or different events that are making money out of BP. That is all within the frame of radical action, as well as things like peacefully occupying oil rigs, or doing a march down South Street without declaring that to the police first so that they can come and stop you. All of these kinds of things are disruptive, but not necessarily directly violent, is within the framework of radical action, and these are things that we massively support on the opposition bench. Okay, now, radical action, on this point of, wouldn't we be getting more done if radical action was effective, given that it's already happening? Now, I bring you back to this point about Insulate Britain, but also about massive changes that have been happening in the governance of my home country, New Zealand, for example, in response to radical action by Greenpeace, which is that radical action has been happening, and we have already been getting major concessions. People in Britain are more able to insulate their homes, which is improving not just the environment, but also just equity concerns, that people are actually warm and can do their work and actually be more healthy and all these kinds of things like that. Massive financial savings for the NHS, all because radical activists came out, they protested on the streets, they made it politically unpalatable to not make concessions. Concessions were made, and we got the positive outcome that we were aiming for. There have been a lot of concessions happening behind the scenes across Europe and America, in New Zealand, because people have brought these issues into the spotlight and made it a political imperative for these things to be addressed, but also gave the ordinary person the opportunity to get behind these issues, to feel that, yes, they already know they care about the environment, they want their children and their children's children to have hope in their future, but now you actually give them something that they can act on. They can sign that petition, they can go to that street march, they can get on board with radical activism in their hometown, but this also increases the visibility of the mainstream movement, so they can get behind that as well and get the personal satisfaction of knowing that they're doing something positive. Proud to oppose.
Thank you very much to Aimee. I would now like to invite Professor Haszeldine back to finish the debate for side opposition. Hear, hear.
How long do I get?
5 minutes.
All right. Okay, we've heard arguments from both sides. and I feel that the proponents in some ways are trying to muddy the water by focusing on the very much media-worthy direct action. So what we mean by radical action and direct action are different. Radical action is, as my colleague Aimee has just said, action through the system, blockades, choices about purchasing, not purchasing, changing institutions from within. Direct action, as was proposed by William, is about inconveniencing people some of the time. That's a different thing. They're both different. You don't need to do both to get change. But I also think direct action is important. So we heard assertions that direct action of blockading hospitals would cause many deaths. I'd like to know how many deaths. Is there a single example of that? We heard allegations that direct action alienates people. I'd like to think about that differently. There's a woman in Sweden called Greta. Has anybody ever heard of Greta? Could you just raise your hand? Greta took direct action. Greta took radical action. What could be more radical than in a quite conformist country to refuse to go to school for years and years? That radical action was extremely successful. So I have a graph here which I don't expect you to read, but it's a graph which shows the amount of media mentions around the world in global literature before Greta, during Greta and after Greta. So before Greta, climate was in the media maybe 20% of the time. After Greta, it's very clear that climate is in the media 80% of the time. I think that's a global impact of radical action, which did not inconvenience individuals very directly, but had a very powerful leverage. It enabled hundreds, it enabled millions, it enabled tens of millions of people to be part of that radical action and have the vision and the ability to join in and make the changes which need to be changed. I think we also heard that change will happen anyway. I think that was an assertion made. I tried to explain in my main presentation that change has not happened anyway from the 1800s through to the 2020s. Oil companies, fossil fuel producers, the established system of extraction and consumption, if anything, is more powerful now than it was 30 or even 50 years ago. To change that system, we have to work together from within, but by working from without, by direct action as well as radical action from within, we gain that media publicity, we gain that Greta effect, to give lots of ordinary people, poor people, rich people, middle class people, people in the south, we give those people the vision and the hope that they can participate and they can join in and they can make a difference. So that's why I think that radical action is essential part of changing the climate of the system of the movement against the established climate change that we're trying to fight against. So radical action avoids apathy. Radical action helps to change the status quo. The image may be important to a few tens of people, may be important to a few hundreds of people, but the image of other people trying to fight for what you believe in from the comfort of your living room or the school gate or the changing rooms at work, that comfort of that other people are taking that action, are putting their careers on the line, their lives on the line sometimes, that's a vision and a leadership position which I think is essential to change. It was mentioned again that radical green groups or so-called activist green groups have made radical action throughout recent history, and I think that's really important. Groups like Sea Shepherd or groups like Greenpeace made an enormous difference to choosing not to dump waste into the oceans. They made an enormous difference to not hunting whales into extinction. Those groups still have a role today in leading that very direct action, but there are plenty of other groups, and Aimee's mentioned them, which are rooted in the grassroots, rooted locally, those groups have a powerful effect by engaging that mass movement in the country, which gives the politicians the courage and the mandate to carry on enacting the Climate Change Act, to carry on asking the Committee on Climate Change to produce its works, so we can all have confidence that we are doing the right thing and we are succeeding. So I suggest that radical action is an essential must-have as part of the climate movement.
I'd like to thank Professor Haszeldine for that fine speech, and now welcome back once again the Father of the House. We won't read into that.
So the first thing I want to separate in your minds is the distinction between direct and radical action. These two things, by definition, are very different. Radical action is, by definition, something that seems out of the norm, something that society does not allow you to do. So boycotts are not an example of radical action because it's something the market allows you to do. What they don't allow you to do is destroy private property. What they don't allow you to do is to blow shit up. They do allow you to make decision choices of what you buy. That is not a radical proposition. It has been done for hundreds, if not thousands of years, choosing who you interact with. Direct action is what gets you away from the apathy trap, where you actually see long-lasting change. Direct action is what allows individuals to feel as if they can have a voice and do something, whereas if they feel as if they need to blow something up to get involved, that's when often you see higher barriers of entry. So, responding to the idea of radical then, I think the question is just simply this. There is a misconception within the room about what changes have emerged as a result of radical action. Yes, we can play example tennis throughout the room. Insulate Britain is one example of how radical action shifted the agenda and made insulation funding slightly higher, but there are a plethora of other examples in which radical action reduced the degree which we're already seeing in society. So the question you just have to actually ask yourself is, does radical action make the average person on the street more or less likely feel as if they can actually get involved and make a meaningful difference? Obviously the answer is it makes it significantly harder for individuals to enter into it. If you feel as if radical action is you have to sit on the M25 or glue yourself to a bank or go halfway around the world like Greta Thunberg, this obviously seems something that is very disabusing or something that seems very hard to achieve. Whereas moderate direct action, actually taking aspects of persuasion, is ways in which we have seen the 25 things I mentioned at the start of my speech achieve and don't see backdrops from them. So responding directly to Parth here, the notion of destruction, I think the argument I'm making is directly aligned to the idea of this. As in, it becomes a self-reinforcing cycle. As in, if younger individuals feel as if they can't get involved in the movement, they tell themselves they can't, they tell other younger individuals, they tell their kids when they have them they can't. It becomes a self-reinforcing idea that the younger individuals do not have, in the majority ways, something to do with the environmental movement. Because in itself, a self-reinforcing cycle, which presumes the destruction of this aspect of inclusivity, which is all I needed to prove. The second, on the aspect of the Global South, hate to break it to Parth, but there's a lot of young individuals in the Global South, which are still privy to the analysis I provided. But the notion that you need more radical action to easily buy into this, the question is solvency. As in, the vast majority of individuals can't engage in radical action, and indeed radical action by their own analysis produces a chilling effect in economics, which makes significantly more people's lives worse as a result, accelerating all of the stuff the Prime Minister already talked about in terms of the ways it disabuses or removes people from the feeling of the movement. The second, in terms of the status quo improvements. This goes along other parts of the floor speeches here, which is just to claim things like inspiration, galvanization, polarization. What is the status quo actually changing in terms of Ian? Recognize that a lot of the things that we have seen in status quo from 1800s to 2020 are results of things like persuasion, not radical action, are results of governments and companies being persuaded by people like Aimee and I that there are actual approaches you can integrate an approach to, rather than radical actions that seem in some ways exceptionally scary, in ways that make companies not want to do them. A good example is the aspect of the New Deal in the European Union, for instance, that was effectively negotiated by moderate individuals, but because they started to pursue more radical actions, like forcing Poland to decarbonize in like 15 years, scared the shit out of Poland and caused massive reactionary backlash, which in itself resulted in the simplification of the Green Deal that we're seeing in the European Union right now. So the argument isn't that the status quo hasn't done something. The argument is the status quo is continuing to do things, but radical action is holding it back insofar as it causes individuals to opt out of things like environmental actions in the first instance. So the central argument of Gov is quite simple in the debate, which is direct action, as the leader of opposition says, is a good thing, but radical direct action is not. because what you actually need in order to get collective change is that very name, right? It's collective. It's individuals feeling as if they can get involved in the movement on all levels, and indeed feeling that they have a voice. Until opposition, which they didn't do, demonstrated why young individuals are not the focal aspect of the group, considering how vocal they are, considering how engaged they are, considering how much engagement they should do, considering they're the people that are going to experience the most of climate change. I think you have to vote, at least analytically, on proposition bench about why actual radical action is bad, because maybe it engages 5 really radical individuals, and Aimee says it's 40-year-olds probably, but the image is that it's young individuals who have the time to do this. You should vote for proposition bench, insofar as radical action, both intuitively and actually, has caused a disengaging effect and has caused the rollback of things that would otherwise happen as things that did happen in the 2010s and now. Proposition.
To William, I'd now like to invite Professor Hulme back to conclude the debate as a whole. Hear, hear.
So thank you to my opponents. Thank you for the speeches from the floor. I want to ask a question of all of you. How many of you self-identify with the environmental movement? Don't be shy. Don't be shy. I would say that's something about 70 or 80% of the people here tonight. A second question, how many of you self-identify, and we've had a very good clarification of what we mean by radical eco-activism, which is radical direct action, as my colleague William has just explained. How many of you identify or have participated in radical eco-activism?
I identify with it. Don't shake your head.
So this is very interesting, isn't it? We have 70 or 80% of the audience this evening would identify with the environmental movement. We have just 2 people, who happen to be our opponents, who have actually engaged in radical eco-activism. I wonder why that is. Why have all of you who self-identify with the environmental movement not participated in radical eco-activism? I'll leave you to ponder that question. Because to me, the heart of this is, what is the point of the environmental movement? The point of the environmental movement is not to have a label saying, I am a member of the environmental movement. The point of the environmental movement is not to make yourself feel good that I'm waving a green flag or I'm paying £10 a month to Friends of the Earth. The whole point of the environmental movement, and tell me if I'm wrong, those of you who are members or identify with the environmental movement, is to see change happen. Change happen. Not protests happen, not clicks on Greta Thunberg's website. That's not the point. The point is to see change happen. So what are the actions that have actually reduced emissions of carbon dioxide? Which, when we're dealing with climate change, is the essence of the problem. As I said before, none of those protesters on the M25 have reduced carbon dioxide emissions by 1 kilogram. What has reduced carbon dioxide emissions are people like Stuart, who through his research is developing technologies that can sequester carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. It's people who have invested their time and their skills in engineering new renewable energy technologies that can displace coal and oil. It is people in Parliament who, and someone mentioned this earlier on, I think it was again my colleague Stuart, in 2008, passing almost unanimously in the House of Commons the Climate Change Act, which established the Climate Change Committee. And that has held the government to account 5 years by 5 years. How did that happen? Why did that happen? I'll tell you why. It didn't happen because people were protesting on the M25 or because people were spraying orange paint over the doors of BP. It happened because the moderate flank got together. They formed, all of the NGOs in Britain formed a coalition in 2006 called the Stop Climate Chaos Coalition to put pressure on politicians. not by radical eco-activism, but by argument, by mass membership, and by deploying both scientific and ethical arguments. That is the task of political persuasion. And that, I would argue, is far, far more effective in bringing down emissions of carbon dioxide than any amount of radical direct action. So I am moving this motion that radical direct action harms the image of the environmental movement, and more than just harming the image, it actually achieves absolutely nothing that matters. What matters is those of you who are part of the environmental movement to engage in activities. We heard examples of getting involved, was it in sustainable forestry or restoring peatlands, or it's working in the engineering and science disciplines because you are the people who are going to invent and discover the next generation of technologies. Those are the things that matter. So I move the motion.
Thank you very much, Professor Hulme. Please join me again in thanking all of our wonderful speakers this evening. Now is arguably the most exciting time of the evening, where we call the House to vote. So, if you side with the proposition, i.e. you believe that radical eco-action destroys the image of the movement, please raise your hands now. Nice and high, please. Okay, thank you very much. And if you side with the opposition, as in you believe that it does not destroy the movement, please raise your hands now, nice and high, thank you. Wonderful, thank you. And any abstentions? Liberals! Wonderful, okay. Thank you very much. So before we announce who has won the debate this evening, it's time for some announcements from the board. So if we can go to Chair of Ways and Means, Alex, please.
Yep.
Thank you.
Right. Hi everyone, I'm Alex. I'm in charge of the public debates. And first of all, let me thank our four wonderful speakers, two of which agreed to speak on very short notice. Thank you, William and Amy. I'm sorry, William. You came close.
You don't know yet.
Right. So as you might know, we do these every week. Of course, we won't have a debate next week, as next week is a spring break, and I hope you'll enjoy that. But coming back, we have some exciting stuff coming along, including week 6, which will be our next debate. This House believes that private property is the bedrock of our democracy, which should be really, really fascinating. Week 7, which is going to be on controversial monuments and whether or not they belong in museums. So if you want to tear down some statues, come along to that one. Week 8, which is this House regrets the influence of religion on education. Sorry. And week 9, where we're doing something quite special and bringing in the director of the Ayn Rand Institute from California, Dr. Yaron Brook, a philosopher specializing on objectivism, and he's going to speak to us. So please come along to all of these, I promise you, it's going to be really good.
Thank you very much to Alex, Chief of his absence. So if we could go to schools, Abby, would you like to do the announcement this week? Thank you.
Of course I can. Hi, I'm Abby. I'm not the head of competitive debate, so I don't get like a fun title like Alex does, but that's fine. If you would like to learn how to debate and decondition like William to give 7-minute, 15-second speeches, knowledge training, it's every Wednesday, 2 till 5, top floor of the Union. It's completely beginner friendly, little presentation, and then there's a debate. And if you're unsure about what's going on, Owen is willing to explain the debate to absolutely anybody and everybody. So he's super friendly, he's super welcome. So it's not on next week, because obviously it's vacation week, but then come along after. Wednesday, top floor of the Union, 2 p.m. We'd love to have you. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's go to our steward, Ariel.
Hi, if you'd like to do what we do every week and go to the top floor of the Union Beacon Bar for a drink, that will be what comes up next. So it'll be a lovely opportunity to have our speakers come join us and have a further conversation. Also, after Vacation Week, please keep an eye on the debate social media, as we have our pub crawl and pub quiz coming up soon as well. Thank you.
Wonderful. Yes, hopefully at the pub, Aimee and Stuart will tell us what kind of radical action they've been involved in. Wonderful. So the only announcement from me really is just to say thank you all for coming and supporting us this evening, and to thank my committee for their hard work this half of the semester. I hope that you all enjoyed this evening and do come back again. Keep an eye on our socials if you're not already following us, please do so. We advertise everything there. Also, if you want to join the mailing list, then come and speak to myself. It's another way to get information about what we're doing. But thank you all very much for coming out and supporting us again, and I hope that you will have a lovely break next week. So, without further ado, the first thing to do is to announce the winner of the floor speech prize, which Ian and I decided this evening goes to Hannah at the back, so congratulations. If you come and see Alex, there's a 50-50 chance he's remembered it this week, so he should be able to
I have it.
Yay! Very well done to Alex, everyone. Wonderful. So this evening, the motion that stood before the House is that this House believes that radical eco-action destroys the image of the movement. The ayes to the right 13, the nays to the left 20, and the abstentions were 8. So the nays have it. The nays have it. Congratulations. 15 times the charm. Thank you very much, everybody. We'll see you at Beacon Bar.